Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Samyukta here, and I will be taking the session on usability heuristics today. So before we get into the session, a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, I'm Samyukta. I have over a decade of experience in the design industry, and I've worked across multiple industries like EdTech, FinTech, and B2B SaaS products. I started my design journey with my master's in human-centered design from UMBC in USA. And presently, I work as an independent design consultant. I mainly focus on creating designs that are scalable as well as user-centered and ensuring that these designs also meet specific business objectives. So with that, let's get into our session. So what are usability heuristics? So before we talk about usability heuristics, I would like to take a moment to talk about usability first, right? So what is usability? Seems pretty intuitive, as the name suggests, usability. It's something that is usable, right? But still, now, what is usable? So there are specific framework or dimensions that you can think about when you think of usable, which is your product easy to learn? Is your product efficient? Is your product functional and effective in its use? Is your product intuitive to use? Is it easy for people to understand how to use your product? So these are some dimensions that you can think of when you're talking about usability, right? Now, again, these are very big words, right? Like easy to learn, intuitive. How do you even know whether something is easy to learn or intuitive? What does it mean to design something that's easy to learn or intuitive, for example? So that's where I would say heuristics kind of come in. Usability heuristics essentially is a set of framework or principles or guidelines, whatever you may want to call it, that basically tells you, gives you certain things to keep in mind while designing so that your end product is more useful, right? So we'll get into it and we'll see these guidelines in more detail to understand what it really means. So here are the 10 usability heuristics as created by Jacob Nielsen. So Jacob Nielsen is one of the forefathers, if I may say, of user experience. These heuristics were actually first came up with them in the 1990s, which is, far before where technology was highly prevalent, right? But although these heuristics were thought of in a physical context more, how do you generally design something that's more user-centered? But these principles also have seen with time seen to hold not just for the physical context, but also be it web design, be it mobile design, or right now today, even when we talk about AI or we talk about virtual reality, these principles very much hold true. So it's something that is very valuable to know and keep in mind when you're designing, because this ensures that whatever you design is ultimately far more easy to use and more usable for the end user. So let's get into what each of these principles are a little bit more in detail. So the first usability heuristic is basically visibility of system status. Now, what this means is essentially that whenever you're designing something, right, you need to keep in mind that the user is always aware of what is happening. The feedback, be it with respect to if the system is doing something in the backend and you're loading something, so giving visibility status in that aspect, or if the user just did some action like save or delete, giving them a immediate feedback of what's happened. So it's basically keeping your communication open at all times with the user and ensuring that the user knows at every single time what is happening. So that is what is meant by visibility of system status. So an example of visibility of system status is, as I mentioned, the loading. Like when something takes a long time, communicating that to the user and telling the user that oh, it is going to take so much time, it's still working on it, and as much information as you can give, right? You would have seen loading screens where you probably just goes as an infinite scroll. So yes, you don't have the data over there as to when your loading will get completed. Versus sometimes you get those percentage indicators versus this example here, right? Syncing 5 of 21, where you know exactly where you are in the process and how far you are from the loading ending. So yeah, just keep in mind to always communicate to the user what's happening at the back end. Moving on to the next usability heuristic, which is match between system and the real world. Now, this sounds a little complicated, I know, but actually it's not that complicated. So this specific heuristic is more in the context of when you're designing something that the user is used to using in the physical world, in the real world, uh, and you are probably creating or digitizing it for the first time, how would you create something that would mimic that experience for the user, right? An example here is, say, for the first time when Amazon came up with Kindle, it was a reading experience. So people are used to physical books. Now, how do you mimic a physical reading experience into a digital experience? So a lot of things which translated to features that Amazon took, where things like bookmarking, highlighting, even the notion of how you were turning the pages. So a lot of interactions also get influenced when you think about how do you want to really mimic something that's in the real world. A lot of examples around this exist even today. Like if you look at the calculator, what we see today is very similar to what physical calculators were like, right? And many icons, if you see, actually take on from the real world, be it the print icon or the save icon, which comes from the floppy disk, or the home that represents a home. So I think it's especially very important. We may not be getting a lot of opportunities to design something that's only in physical world right now today, but especially when you think about icons and things like that, it becomes very important to make it more relatable for the user from their real world context. So this doesn't, as the description goes, this doesn't apply just to visual designs. Also, like at times the words that you use, like home or print, could also be things that are relatable for the user in the real world. Moving on to the next one, which is user control and freedom. As the name suggests, giving user control and freedom. But the key thing to keep in mind here is that you need to ensure when you're designing that you always make the user feel like they are in control. They don't ever feel like they are overpowered or the system is taking over my life or making decisions for me, especially when we talk about AI right now, right? In the context of AI, how are we going to ensure that we still give the user the sense of control and freedom, that they are still in control? So it's very important that user always feel like they are in control of the system. So even if they're making certain actions, an ability for them to undo those actions and go back and never make a lot of critical decisions for the user. Even if you're making certain decisions, check with the user. That doesn't mean, again, that you don't automate anything and ask the user to make every single decision. This is where your design judgment kind of comes in. But underline, you need to ensure that the user feels in control and doesn't ever feel that the system is taking decisions for them or is not allowing them to do what they want to do, right? An example here is basically around having an option, like once you've published something, still having an option to unpublish it and go back to the previous status. So that's about user control and freedom. Next one, consistency and standards. This is one of my most favorite usability heuristics, I would say. So talking about consistency and standards, right? Here I would like to touch upon two specific things when you talk about consistency. There you have one, which is your internal consistency, and second, which is your external consistency. So let's look at both of these one after the next. So the first one, when we talk about internal consistency, right? So it's about when you're designing a product or a suite of products. Maybe you're working for a brand, like say Amazon, for example. Amazon has many different sub-products within them. Now, how would you ensure that there is still some sort of a consistency? Now, this can be taken in the context of a brand consistency, or it could also be like, say, within a product, you have like a vast product. How do you ensure that if you are building a visual language or some sort of a language with the communication to the user, that is consistent? A very simple example in this is, if you have in your product that you have a specific purple color, say, for example, for call to action buttons as a primary thing, and that's only place that you are usually using in your product, the primary button with a purple color, the user begins to associate that purple color and that button with a click and the primary action. Now, suddenly, if you use purple color somewhere else, that's breaking the consistency, and it's going to break the language for the user, and it's going to create more confusion for the user. So internal consistency is basically within a product. How do you ensure consistency? This is where you end up using components, design libraries, patterns, so that your consistency doesn't break. So one other thing to keep in mind, yes, visual like buttons and components, illustration styles, those are those can be consistent, but also words. If you're using, say, take a demo as a thing throughout in your thing, so people are going to start associating demo with something. But suddenly, if you say instead of demo a call somewhere else, that's again going to cause confusion. So not just visual, also words that you're using needs to be consistent throughout your platform. Now, that's about internal consistency. Now, what is external consistency? This is what I really, really like. So external consistency basically talks about so very important thing to keep in mind, right? Your product is not the only product that the user is using. The user in their everyday life are interacting with physical things, as we saw in the previous thing, but they're also interacting with a lot of other web applications and apps. So if you are, say, for example, building an e-commerce, designing an e-commerce website, yours is not the only e-commerce website. There are like thousands of e-commerce websites out there, right? And which most certainly your user is interacting with. So now your user's mental model, or what they expect from an e-commerce website, is a language that has been built through their interactions with all these other e-commerce websites, all these other e-commerce applications. So they are going to expect from your application what these other applications are doing predominantly, right? The most common patterns that exist in these other applications, the user is going to expect from your application too. Which is why it becomes very important to understand, if you're working, say, in a specific e-commerce thing, what are the other e-commerce things and what are the other things people are using? What is their expectation going to be like? What is the user's mental model going to be like? You need to understand those and replicate those and not break it, because breaking those will actually end up in like a poor user experience, right? An example here is, again, taking the e-commerce example, your shopping cart, it's common to expect that your shopping cart will be in the top right corner. That doesn't make any sense for you to hide it or put it down or put something else. You could try it, test it out. Maybe it works really well for you, but especially when you're breaking a pattern, be extra cautious about it. Ensure you are doing all the checks and tests to know that it works and it's not breaking for the user. Moving on to error prevention. So when we talk about error prevention, right, it's essentially about ensuring that you are not letting the users enter any lot of erroneous decisions or conditions, right? Couple of examples here to make it more clear. When someone is entering, say, an email ID or a password in this case, as an example, it's expected to be entered in a specific format, right? So making that format upfront, clear upfront, ensuring that they are entering it. If it's an email, it needs an and something.com. So there's no point in submitting the form if the email is not in the correct format, right? And you could also think of making it even better in terms of even error prevention. But that's essentially error prevention, not taking down the user down the path of some error and then much later throwing an error. That's one thing. The other thing also is at a more, looking at it from a more high stake errors, say a banking or a fintech application, you don't want the user to be sending a huge amount to an account that is not like unintentionally. So how do you prevent and ensure that such high stake things are not happening? Like the user is not ending up spending a huge amount to an account that they did not even intend to. So these unintentional actions, especially when it's high stake, needs to be absolutely prevented. Some of the common things that I frequently use in these things in this context is, if you have, say, in a table like a delete and a save, or a delete and an edit right next to each other, that's bad design, because user can very easily unintentionally click on delete. A good way to counter this would be like having a confirmation modal for a delete to ensure that user doesn't end up accidentally deleting something. And even better thing would be to ensure that these are not close to each other. And secondly, if it makes sense in the context of your design, putting like negative actions in a layer below, right? And especially if they are actions that are not going to be taken very frequently, hide them, don't keep it on the top layer. That way it gets prevented, the error gets prevented very easily. Moving on. So just to recap, we have gone through 5 of the usability heuristics. We have 5 more left. I'll just take a moment here to pause to see if you have any other questions. Please comment, leave a comment if you have any questions, and I can look at addressing it. And for each of these also, please think for yourself, like whenever you use any application, or whenever or when we are going through this, if anything from your experience of using mobile app strikes, please do share. That would be really helpful for everyone. Moving on. So we have 5 more usability heuristics to cover. The 6th one is recognition rather than recall. So let's make this a little fun, okay? So let me ask you this question. What are the 10 usability heuristics of Jacob Nielsen? Now, when you're thinking of answering this question, make a mental note of how you're going about it. What are you doing? What are you processing? How difficult or easy this task is for you to think and recollect what are the 10 usability heuristics. You realize how much effort you're putting, right? So that's basically the amount of cognitive load that someone would go through if you're expecting them to recall something, remember something that they have seen before without any additional cues in front of them, right? So now, as opposed to that, now if I ask you, is visibility of system status one of Jacob Nielsen's usability heuristic? Now, what is the effort involved in answering that? So are you able to compare and see the effort or the cognitive load in recall, where you were trying to remember and recollect something that you encountered a little while back, versus something that I kept in front of you and I asked, is it that? And you just had to recognize it. So that's a fundamental principle behind recognition and recall. Recall involves recall, or if you want to say it, remembering something from memory, involves far more cognitive load, involves a higher cognitive load for the user compared to recognition. Now, how this plays out in what we design is, wherever it makes sense in your design, ensure that you are not forcing the user to recall or remember something that they did in the past, but you have enough cues in front of them so that they can quickly recognize and move on, right? An example here that you see is, if you are part of an e-commerce website, user has browsed something and come back, easy access to things that they viewed in the past. So that's one example of how recognition and recall plays out in our design. So moving on, the next usability heuristics is flexibility and efficiency of use. So as the name suggests, this is essentially ensuring that your users have enough freedom and flexibility within the product. What this means from the design perspective is that in your design, you ensure that you are removing any repetitive or mundane tasks for the user. You're not designing in a way that the user has to go through complex repetitive things just to get a basic thing done, right? Because that would be lack of efficiency for the user. Sometimes it might also mean giving them a little bit of customization and personalization and flexibility to modify things a little bit in the way that they would like for it to be. Other example here also is from an efficiency perspective, shortcuts, right? If you have keyboard shortcuts, that adds to a lot of flexible efficiency for the user. An example that's showcased here on the right is that of a medium text, where from an editing perspective, you have like a very quick edit that's opened up as soon as you highlight something. Either you note or you do something or you add a quote. These are basically very quick edit actions. Doesn't throw all the edit options at you, but at least the most frequently used edit options to the user. Moving on, the 8th usability heuristics we'll talk about is aesthetic and minimalist design. Now, when you talk about minimalist design, the thing that comes very strongly is, oh, it's a visual thing. No, it's not a visual thing. It's not all about white spaces. It's not all about, oh, keeping it good looking and nice looking. No, what does that really translate to? Clean looking or clutter free. What does it translate to? It essentially means that what minimalism derives it from, right? Which is when you have a design in front of you, rip off and remove any unessentials, anything that's irrelevant or not necessary, remove it off. And what you're left with in the end are only things that are absolutely necessary for the user to make the decisions that they need to make. That is what minimalist is about. Obviously, if you talk about a complex enterprise software or something, it's not going to be something like this, right? Yet, how do you approach it in a way that you only have the relevant things for the user in front of them as they need it, make things more contextual if needed? That's what this specific heuristic is about. Moving on. The 9th usability heuristic is to help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. Now, this is mainly about when you see an error message, how do you kind of communicate that error, right? This was highly prevalent actually a long while back in the 90s and like the early 90s, when there weren't a lot of designers and most error messages were really, really, really bad. In the sense they used to be technical, the call to actions were not clear, and there were no user often felt like they didn't know what to do next, right? So that's where this principle, this guideline essentially comes from, which is when you're designing an error message, first use a plain and simple language, a language that the user can understand very simply and easily. Give enough information that's needed, not technical again. Not technical, yes. Ensure your call to actions are very clear. No simple yes, no, because most times they don't make sense and they end up being very confusing because you don't know what you're saying yes to or no to. So make your call to actions very clear. Like in the example, you're like review cart or dismiss, right? So make the resolution very clear for the user. And the resolution call to actions being clear is one thing, labeling it clearly is one thing, also ensuring that the when an error has happened, ensuring that the user knows what the error is and what happened. And secondly, how do they recover from it? What do they need to do on their front to resolve it? Sometimes it might be as simple as, oh, you cannot do anything, but come back later. Come back after 5 minutes or an hour to see if we are up again, if the system is truly down, right? So that's what you need to ensure, that you communicate very clearly in case of any kind of error messages. These also apply to, your 404 errors and your 502 errors and all those kind of technical errors that happen in websites. So last but not the least, help and documentation. So it's true that when we design something, we are to design in a way that the user doesn't ever have to seek help or look up a documentation. The design is super intuitive, super awesome. The user knows exactly what needs to be done. But sometimes, unfortunately, either the products are complex or just that some users amongst your user group might need a little bit more support. So always ensure you have some sort of help and documentation. These need not be extensive documentation for every single thing. It doesn't have to be a product walkthrough in every single instance, right? It's just a space where a user can go to whenever they feel stuck. The solution here could be in terms of documentation, could be in terms of video tutorials, could be in terms of FAQs, or could just be a person or a human or a chatbot that's available that can help you resolve whatever problem the user is going through. So that's what help in documentation is all about. So to conclude, that brings us to the end of the 10 design usability heuristics of Jacob Nielsen. As we saw, these are the 10 usability heuristics. Now, few things to summarize, right, on these usability heuristics. These are not rigid rules that you need to follow. These are guidelines that you need to keep in mind when you're designing. And I would personally suggest you keep in mind the fundamental principles behind it, right? The fundamental, like when we talked about user control and freedom, ensure that the user feels in control and they are not like a slave of the machine. That's the fundamental thing that you need to keep in mind. So ensure you hook on to the underlying guiding thought behind these things. As much as it's good to follow these as much as possible to ensure that your product or your design is more usable, but there are also times when you need to know when to break these, because if people had not broken these principles, some of the innovations truly would not have existed. Think of the pull down to refresh, right? Like, did a pull down to refresh interaction ever exist? No, it did not exist, but it was innovated. None of the platforms used, but one platform used one fine day, and it's become a new pattern that every platform follows, right? So there's always some beginning to things. There are innovations happen that way, but we need to keep in mind that whenever we are breaking something, we test it enough to know that it's working and it's not hampering the usability. Again, keep that in mind. And as we said, yes, these usability heuristics help you guide and ensure that your design is more usable. And the consequences of it is, if it works, yes, your design is more easy to learn, more intuitive, and things like that. And the counter of it is it leads to frustration. It might lead to lose of trust amongst the users and things like that. So those would be the negative consequences of your product or your design not being more usable. So yeah, this is summary that we already went through. And thank you. That's all. If you have any questions, please comment and feel free to ask anything that you may have. And I would love to hear more examples around these usability heuristics. A good way for you to get these like in your mind would be anytime you use a product, go whenever. Now, if you're going back using Instagram or any app that you're using, keep thinking about which usability heuristics is it fulfilling or not fulfilling. You'll come up with tons of examples even using a single product. I would love to see your thing explore, and I would love to see the examples that come out post this session. Thank you so much. I'm happy to have taken the session, and I hope you learned something new. And if you have any other feedback for me in terms of things that did not work in the session also, I would be happy to hear that too, so that the future sessions could be much better. Thank you.